Hi everyone, and welcome to this latest Tortoise Thinking. My name is Arnon Menon from King's College in London. I have to say, when the lovely staff at Tortoise said to me, "What song would you like?" and I mentioned that that was my lockdown anthem, I didn't expect them to actually play it, so I'm feeling very happy about that. Thank you. I'm delighted to be joined by a wonderful panel of people to talk about this theme, Is Britain Unravelling? We've got Gavin Esler, the broadcaster and author, Matthew Dancona of This Manor, as they say, and Kerry Davis from NatSen, who knows every statistic we've ever known. Don't you, Kerry? And they're going to be sharing their thoughts, but also we're very, very keen to hear from you. And so if you have questions, what I'll try and do is get to as many of you as possible. And I think what we'll try and do is get you on the screen to ask your question rather than me butchering it by trying to read it out. But just to kick off then, I mean, for me, under this sort of broad theme of Britain unravelling, I suppose, is Britain changing? How is it changing? And should we be concerned about the fact that it's changing? And Gavin, let me kick off with you, if that's okay. Oh, Gavin, you might have to click your unmute button.
There you go. Yeah, I've just published a book called How Britain Ends, and I suppose the title is a bit of a giveaway. It seems to me that Britain, rather than thinking of Britain unravelling, I ask the question a different way, which is who actually articulately speaks for Britain and Britishness as what it means to be British anymore. Who is there in our public life who is making a credible unionist argument? And when I go to Scotland, which is where I grew up, and I say, well, Boris Johnson's a one nation conservative, and they say, so many people say, yeah, and that one nation is England. And conservatives in Scotland that I know and I've known for years say things like, well, when he comes, the Prime Minister of our country comes to Scotland, we publicly welcome him and we die a little inside because we think he does the work of the SNP for them. And when I go to Northern Ireland, I've got Northern Ireland roots among the unionist community in Northern Ireland. I happened to be there in October 2019 when, in the words of some of my unionist friends, Boris Johnson threw 100 years of Ulster unionism into the Irish Sea, something that we are seeing the results of, I suppose, most recently. And I was reminded by one of them, Mrs. Thatcher said Northern Ireland is as British as Finchley. Boris Johnson's made it as British as France. So you can disagree with the way in which those people think. You can also say these are anecdotes, not statistics, but there are some statistics which suggest that the tectonic plates of the idea of Britishness has shifted, and it always has. You know, we've reinvented ourselves every 100 years since 1603, usually as a result of something bad happening, and almost always as a result of Protestantism, empire, and war, as Linda Colley brilliantly puts it in her book, Britons. The last time was 1921, when 26 counties of the Irish Republic, Free State as it was then, seceded. And the United Kingdom lost 22% of its land. Germany only lost 13% of its land in the Versailles Treaty, and we lost even more. So we have reinvented ourselves into very difficult times. But there is nobody I can think of that is credibly making the argument for reinvention now. What we have is George Osborne saying, if you don't want the Scots to leave, don't let them vote in it. We've got Gordon Brown, who would like to make this argument, saying we risk becoming a failed state. And we've got Brexit into the mix, which is also pulling us apart. And just one final thought. I noticed at the start of the programme, there was a question, what makes British people proud? Well, the top two things were the NHS and British history. Now, the NHS is a wonderful thing, but it's very highly devolved. And we've seen Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland in coronavirus times going slightly different ways at a slightly different pace. And we've seen some of the great cities of Northern England also saying what you were suggesting to us in London isn't quite what we want, even though vaccination programs are a great success. And as for British history, just this final point, I listened to Jacob Rees-Mogg in Tory party conference in 2017, and he likened Brexit to, he said, Agincourt, Crécy, and Waterloo. Well, Waterloo was won by the British, but also working with Blücher and the Prussian troops. The other two battles, the Scots and the Irish, I don't know about the Welsh, but we were on different sides. So the idea of British history as being some kind of heritage park, which everybody agrees what it looks like, is just not true. And in Ireland in particular, and also in Scotland, we can go into that if you wish, those are also parts of the tectonic plates that are pulling us apart.
Thank you. I mean, there's an awful lot there. I forgot to say, and you can see it in the chat, that Gavin has just authored a book, How Britain Ends. I have this deep-seated hatred of people who actually write books rather than signing contracts for them and never delivering, which is my chosen approach. And talking of books, Matt, you've just got one out as well, which talks about the new divisions in Britain a little bit, doesn't it? And also talks about whether or not we should wish them away or just address them head on.
Yeah, no, that's true. And I guess, I like Gavin, I see a change, and it's certainly true that when I started writing about politics, there was a thing called unionism, which was about more than institutions. There was a kind of sense of allegiance, and certainly on the Conservative side of the house, it meant a lot, and it would have been inconceivable to do to Northern Ireland what has happened under Brexit. I think Gavin's spot on about that, and clearly devolution, which was meant to bind Britain together, has not had that consequence at all. And it's also raised questions of not only about what Englishness is, but also further devolution to the region. So the sense, the trajectory is away from the centre, and the division between London as a kind of modern 21st century city-state and the rest is also a dangerous fissure, I think. I suppose where I worry most, and I'm also most optimistic, is the broad heading of culture wars. I worry a lot about the weaponization of culture wars by this government and their attempt, their clear strategy that once they see the pandemic as, pushed to one side as the main item under discussion, they want to pick a lot of fights about statues and flags and things like that. And this, of course, plays into a general fear of what is broadly called identity politics. And one of the points I make in the book is that identity politics is not the great untamed monster that a lot of liberals and centrists think it is. It's both here to stay. It's a serious reproach to kind of contemporary liberalism and meritocracy. Groups like BLM and Me Too movement and so on are actually making entirely valid points about the fact that the myth of the level playing field is indeed a myth, and these are important, very important messages which need to be taken on board and addressed practically. And this is a good thing. And I think that there are aspects of identity politics to do with the whole idea of having to stay in your lane, only being allowed to address things which you're personally involved with it. And perhaps we can go on to talk about some of the issues around free speech, which are, which need to be dealt with. But the general, the rising of identity politics, if it's acted upon, is all for the good. And I think we're fast approaching the first anniversary of the murder of George Floyd, and many promises were made on May 25th and thereafter about what would be done to address racial injustice around the world, both by governments and corporations. And I think it's extremely important that their feet be held to the fire, and that we see action and not just social media posts and targets which are then quietly abandoned. So my general feeling is that we're in a period of huge flux, and it's a time of enormous opportunity as well as challenge, and that we need to be aware of that flux because it's not going away. In the modern, the modern world of politics is dominated by networks rather than institutions. And that means that you have to be much more nimble than you used to be. And the question which arises, and still remains on the table is what will be the sources of social cohesion in the future. And a lot of that, I think, does speak to a general redrawing of the social contract, and also about what makes people loyal to a broader group than their immediate affinity group in the 21st century. Because again, that's not obvious. Is the nation state still viable as a kind of source of binding allegiance? I mean, these are legitimate questions. I mean, probably the answer is it ought to be, but I agree with Gavin that the quest for a Britishness, and more to the point, who define it, is very moot. I remember a book I was involved in about 12 years ago, which I edited with Gordon Brown, called Being British, was a collection of essays on this subject. And it was an attempt by a lot of people to define what Britishness meant. And it was a noble effort, I think, by the people who contributed. But a lot of their contributions amounted to no more than saying things like decency and fair play and values that no liberal democratic nation would disown. So I think we've reached a point where there are a whole series of factors coming into play and converging. And what's really important is that the debate is carried out both with an even temper, but with a view to practicality and not just to raise tempers and outrage.
I mean, the other interesting thing worth adding, I suppose, is that different conceptions of Britishness feed into different positions on that value divide you spoke about. So if you're British in England, you're probably a Remainer. If you're British in Scotland, you're quite possibly a Leaver. And that just makes things a hell of a lot messier than it would otherwise be. I want to come back on a whole load of points there. Sure. And also, just as a warning, if you're willing, Andrew Goodwood, I'd like just to give you a chance to speak after we've heard from Kerry, because we are going to talk about flags, because it's all you're talking about in the chat at the moment. So we're going to introduce that theme. But Kerry, you know the data. Is Britain changing? Are our social attitudes shifting? Are there things that are really striking and new about how we think about things these days?
Well, I think one of the interesting places to start is that a kind of our latest time series data from British Social Attitude Survey actually tells us that a sense of Britishness is growing compared to opting for a kind of an English identity, for example. So I think that certainly in the last couple of years, it's definitely been argued that within England, particularly, the result of the Brexit vote, for example, was an indication of an increase in the prevalence of English identity, and what we're seeing a kind of, certainly in the political discourse, around a kind of fragmentation or a regionality, which has risen up both post-Brexit, but also in the context of the pandemic. But actually, since 2014, the proportion of people who say that they're English has fallen year on year. From about 40% to just over about a third now. And conversely, what we're seeing then in the same period is the proportion who are choosing, okay, albeit within a single survey question, but when forced to have to choose, are opting for a British identity to just over half. So I think there's something interesting in terms of the question of unravelling, or the nature of the composition of that identity, which is probably more interesting than the stat itself around whether or not people are opting for something in the survey question. And I think that certainly within other research that we've done more recently in 2020, funded actually by UK and Changing Europe, looking at the perspectives of wealthy Leave voters. Both Leavers and Remainers in that research saw the referendum in particular as having heightened Britain's social divides, and felt very much that it was important that the country has a clear sense of identity to unite itself over. So we have that. We have this idea that a notion of Britishness, as opposed to any other kind of nation statehood, is potentially decreasing. But there are really clear paths, not unsurprisingly. So going back to the kind of values question, around what Leavers and Remainers wanted Britain to take pride in, and the makeup of what that identity is. So I think one of the other things that some research that the British Social Attitude Survey has demonstrated is looking back to some of the points that Gavin was making about what are some of the attributes of being truly British. What are these ideas? And Matt, you were mentioning it as well, in terms of some basic hygiene factors about values of what it might be to be in a liberal democracy. But beyond that, what else are we seeing? And I think some of the things that were rising to the top, or did certainly at that time, and I think are still being borne out slightly, which starts to complicate the debate around identity, are basic factors such as an ability to speak English, having British citizenship, these kind of symbols and artifacts of being British, respecting our laws and institutions. also feeling British was considered to be a kind of, almost 3/4 of people would opt for that as feeling truly British, but none of that particularly gets us into some of the differentiation within that, and the fact that for a variety of reasons, we're kind of situated differently on some of those basic values. I think one of the interesting shifts potentially from a kind of survey from a statistical basis is that the same data in terms of what might make one truly British, one of the things we've seen a decline in is religion. And the role that Christianity plays, or Christian values are seen as being important to being British, but no doubt, reflecting Britain's declining religious faith overall. And the reason I raise that point is because I think it starts to intersect with another question in terms of questions around identity, the extent to which we should, whether we might find issues to coalesce around, or whether we should be worried at all, is that with a kind of decline, if you like, in religious faith, and I think that previous research, actually not done by NatSen, but done by the BBC as part of a kind of on Englishness type project they did in 2018, suggests that British identity is considered more inclusive than English identity, that somehow comes with it some values around multiculturalism. And so there is some threads there which suggest that a more pluralizing and modern conception of Britishness might be have the possibility to emerge. Still doesn't quite address some of the questions of quite what it's made up of. But I think one of the risks around that at the moment, in terms of what we know from some recent research and going back to those wealthy leavers in particular, is that by the same token, possibilities around pluralizing and moderning, that's not a word, modernizing. It is now, thank you. You can write that down. Is actually a lot of those same people in that kind of comfortable leaving category are actually lamenting multiracial and multi-religious society as an indicator and unease of the fact that we might be losing a Britishness. So as much as we can construct a picture, I think, in some of the kind of survey and research data around both an increase in Britishness and some, statistically consistent picture on what the different attributes of being truly British might be, I think that where we're at the moment in terms of the political landscape in particular, and the divisions that are within that, are starting to introduce tensions, for want of a better word, in terms of where those two things are coming into conflict immediately. So on the one hand, you have the possibility of pluralism. On the other hand, you have that as an indicator that Britishness is in decline. So yeah, I'll leave it there.
I have to say, oh my God, when they said to me, keep an eye on the chat, I didn't realise just how chatty people at Tortoise are. I mean, the chat's gone absolutely mad. I'm struggling to keep up. I don't know who these people are who write so much. But anyway, but Kerry, can I just ask you one question as a follow-up, which is, there is a secular trend as well, isn't there? I mean, whatever the divergences in our population, we are becoming more socially liberal as a population as time goes on, aren't we?
Certainly, and I would expect, I'm looking forward to the census data coming out, because I think that will also continue to indicate that trend. One thing that I didn't say, which I will just say because I think it's going to come up obviously, and some of the statistics that were shown at the beginning there, that I think one of the other aspects of some of the potential problematics of this idea of a kind of pluralist modern conception of Britishness versus the alternative is that quite a lot of people in some of our more recent qualitative research were very kind of, they have this nostalgic optimism, which won't be, you'll know about this, Anand, from that work, around how Britain should be, this kind of restoration of pride in the past. And all of the connotations that come with that at a very simple level around kind of history and geography, and mentions of kind of post-Second World War, and even going far, as far back as Empire, which bring with it a whole host of highly problematic and highly contentious, and I would say, from my personal perspective, unideal connotations. And I'm fascinated by how that, how Brexit has forced potentially this moment of change around identity and Britishness. This kind of harking back to a nostalgic optimism, and actually also how that comes into conflict with some of the things we've just seen on the statistics at the beginning of this talk, in terms of a kind of awareness and a wish to kind of educate and decolonize, but actually the reality of daily lives versus those perspectives. So,
is it possible to get Andrew on? I don't know how we do this bit actually, so there's going to be a pregnant pause while everyone sits.
Oh yeah.
Oh, hi, are you Andrew?
Yes.
Oh, superb. Do you want to just say what you said about the flag? And we
With my typical grace, I admitted that I have a sense of unease these days when I see a St. George flag, the cross, dangling from somebody's flat or from a car. I'm sorry, but I over the years, maybe in the last 10 years, it's come to suggest to me a bit of xenophobia that I worry about. I mean, I am Scottish. I live in Edinburgh, but I used to travel a lot, and it's become toxic, I think.
And the Saltaire, what does that make you think?
Do you know what? The Saltaire is different. The Saltaire tends to suggest to me that it's either a football fan or a Scottish nationalist. And the Scottish, and what Scottish football fans and nationalists do in common is try and be better than their neighbour to convince you as a whole that they are worth supporting.
Okay, interesting. So what do you make of that, Gavin? You think that's a grist to your mill, is it, that the sort of symbols of Englishness are viewed in that way in Scotland?
Well, I think, look, nationalism is an interesting, huge concept, and at the edges it is incredibly nasty and very difficult everywhere. But there's what strikes me, two things. One is that you see the St. George's flag a lot more, and it's outside the football grounds. It's in different places. It's in housing estates than it used to be. There remains a kind of slight English cultural cringe about the English flag. And it is certainly true, to go back to Kerry's point, for instance, Anna Sarwar, the new Labour leader in Scotland, would quite happily describe himself as a Scottish Asian. I don't speak for anybody, but I can only tell you that my friends who are people of colour in this country would tend to call themselves, if they're in England, British Asian, or they would use the word British. They would not tend to call themselves, I don't know anybody actually personally, there may be some who would call themselves an English Asian. I've not heard that. And so English identity is slightly difficult in that sense. And it's always been confused, of course, because, you know, if you're 84% of the population of the United Kingdom and you're English, because it's the biggest, it's the elephant in the bed, you sometimes will say English when you mean British and British when you mean English. And personally, I'm kind of relaxed about that, but nobody in Scotland would ever do the same thing. And I love there's a wonderful comment from Cecil Rhodes about 120 years ago, where he said, British imperialist, right? So he said, ask any man anywhere what he would rather be, and 99% of men would say they'd rather be English. So it is both particularly for people in Scotland and Ireland and Wales, it can be seen to be an exclusive term, whereas Britishness has always been a more inclusive term. And so if we're less interested in calling ourselves British in certain places, or as one friend of mine, I would say Scottish conservative, used to say, I'm Scottish, I'm British, I'm European. And then when I saw that particular friend and others at the Edinburgh in 2019, after he digested what Brexit meant, he said, those people in London, meaning Westminster, are taking away my European identity. And I choose rather to lose the British identity and be Scottish and European. Now, again, you can quarrel with that and you can say Europe and EU are not the same and all that, but that is how some people think. And it seems to me on the day in which Scotland is voting about its future in one sense, those are the people who voted no in 2014 to independence. That's the wedge that the SNP and other parties who want independence are targeting and should target, because they are the people who may have changed their minds as a direct result of Brexit.
Well, that's interesting. And the thing about the European Union point is interesting, isn't it? Because it's quite an institutional view of identity. We've left the institutions, so my identity has changed. On which point, if Louise Simpson and Flo Cairns can be lined up, because they've both got sort of, in a sense, institutional answers to identity questions, which I think will be interesting. But Matt, if I can just come back to you for a sec. I mean, firstly, if you'd like to add anything on the point about the flags, but I've got another question for you as well, if you don't want to talk about that. Oh, you're muted.
Am I okay now?
Yeah.
I think it's horrible the way that the flags have become so loaded. I particularly hate the idea that flags should have become sort of compulsory. You know, the idea that you have to have the Union flag behind you if you're a politician seems to me to be total misunderstanding of what Britishness really is about. I also understand why people think the St. George's flag carries connotations of racism, because a lot of racists have used it. Interestingly, I think it was decontaminated for a bit around the time of Euro 96.
Yeah.
But I think that everything that's happened in between, and the identitarianism of UKIP and also the transformation of the Conservative Party from a unionist party into actually the English Nationalist Party in practice, has meant that it does alarm people. There's no question about that. So I think that's a real shame. The other element in all of this, I just think, just one quick point, is that I think it's really important not to miss the sort of consumerization of allegiance, which is that a lot of this has come about because we've had so many referendums. And people forget how many referendums we've had, actually. Up until the period when there was a whole flurry of them under New Labour, over Northern Ireland, over devolution, and then the London mayoralty, then under the coalition over AV, and then regrettably over Brexit. What you have is the sudden transformation of parliamentary democracy into a sort of permanently sitting grand focus group. And so I find it very difficult when posed by the question, should the Scots have another referendum? Because why shouldn't they? I mean, there are referendums about everything else. It's very hard. If today's results yield a nationalist majority at Holyrood, I find it very difficult to see the grounds upon which, given our recent history, the Scots shouldn't have another referendum, given that we've now become a referendal society, which is, probably regrettable, but that cat is long out the bag.
I can see Kerry couldn't stop grinning when you were talking about this sort of this long-running national focus group. It was like manna from heaven for Nats, the idea.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Have we got Louise and Flo in either order? Actually, it's quite interesting because you're both talking about institutions as answers to some of these questions. Louise, I can see you.
Hello.
Hi.
So which bit did you like? Because I've been a bit verbose.
Oh, sorry. I'll tell you, I'm completely losing track. The federal bit.
Well, I think that's a great chance for England. I mean, I think we're heading there anywhere, and you think of, with all the increased numbers of mayors and things like that. And I think it's a good chance for England. I mean, England, the Scottish thing, I hope Scotland will go for independence. So let's just say Scotland is now in Europe. But yes,
Why
the chance.
do you hope that?
Because I just see their future there. I don't see their future sort of as a sort of lag on to England, abused by England for hundreds of years. I mean, right from the Treaty of Arbroath, where again, the English put the fear of God into the Scots in financial terms, which held them to the Union, which is what they did in 2014, and is no doubt, is what Johnson is doing now, bribing the Scots to stay in the Union with all this extra money. But actually, I think the promises that were made in 2014 were never honoured by England.
Okay.
But anyway, for the federal thing, I think the federal thing is really important. And I'm an absolute 1,000,000% Remainer. But I think that it is one chance for the country to level up, is that the federalism is really strong, and it can include devolution and include the loss of Ireland to Ireland, Northern Ireland to join Ireland. A federal everything, a federal United States of Europe is what I would like. But, with Brexit, we have to put that we put that aside. But you could still work on the same sort of systems.
But for the moment, you're thinking about a federal England, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I'm saying that
Right,
as a last shot for it not to just kind of implode completely.
Flo, I will come back to you in a sec, but I want to put something just to Kerry on that. And this might be really unfair. If it's unfair, Kerry, just say, I don't know. Is there public support for devolution or federalism in England? Because my understanding has always been that the public have been rather lukewarm about this.
I don't think we've got any, I don't have any evidence to contradict that. I mean, I think that the one thing that I would say is that possibly accelerated by the circumstances of the pandemic, idea of regionality and having a kind of a more kind of localized forms of decision making and power, where the distance to Westminster now feels a bit too far, or indeed that Westminster might not be holding the best interests of anybody outside of that bubble, for want of a better phrase. So I think that there's some evidence that well, quite often in public attitudes research, what you hear, especially when you're talking about nationalism and devolution, is that there will be a voice that says that England doesn't have its own parliament. And we've heard that again recently in some work that we've done. So I think that voice is there, but whether indeed we can, I don't think that we've got particular evidence that says that there's kind of overwhelming public support for that move at this time. But I do think people want their politicians to listen to them more closely.
I will come to you, Gavin and Matt, in a minute, but Flo, if you're there, you had an interesting suggestion as well about something that might change the way we think, I think, if you are.
Hi, I can't video and audio, so you've just got me on sound. Hope that's okay. So full disclosure, I'm in South Queensferry, so in Scotland. I'm seeing Britishness defined by our government and spending our money on it, flags behind everybody. It feels a bit jingoistic, if I'm using that word correctly. I just wondered if we reformed first past the post, so Westminster was more representative, we'd be spending money and defining Britishness in a slightly different, less jingoistic way.
That's really, really interesting. Matt, I'm going to pick on you. Have you got any thoughts on that?
Sorry. Yes. I mean, well, I suppose my principal thought is that there was a referendum on electoral reform. Admittedly, the option put to the public was not especially energizing, and it was comprehensively rejected. So I always worry about electoral reform as the answer to things, because actually to get to electoral reform, you have to have done a great deal first to get it past Parliament and public. It does have, there are arguments for it. It is arguably, there are arguably fairer electoral systems than first past the post. That's clear. I sort of feel it gets wheeled out in debates when we've run out of other options. I think the critical thing here is that there's been a moment of secession in Brexit, which is actually revolutionary in character in ways that really were not fully understood at the time. And I know that infuriates leavers who insist that they were fully aware of what they were doing. But I'm not at this point talking about the were leavers bigoted argument. I'm talking about the whole point that if you dislodge a country that is nestled within another supranational group for 4 decades, there are going to be big consequences, especially if parts of it, conspicuously Scotland, wanted to remain part of that supranational group. And then it has, as we've discussed, huge implications for Northern Ireland. So suddenly it's not freedom you're looking at, but smallness. And I think that, we haven't really spoken about Britain's place in the world, but one of the things that is already being discussed at the UN in a sort of prototypical way is, if Scotland leaves and if Northern Ireland's relationship to the mainland changes more, does the UK necessarily deserve a permanent seat on the Security Council? Now, that might sound a very technical point, but it isn't. It's a really important element of our sort of global reach, our global power, our geostrategic strength. And that's another change, because what's interesting is that any discussion of Britishness up till about 10 years ago would have included quite high on the list our defense capability, our sense of security, our national security, that we were part of the free world, and that we punched above our weight, and all the cliches you're aware of. My general concern is that whatever Britishness is going to be in future, it's going to look smaller. And that's not a good starting point. The list of things that bind us is getting smaller, almost sort of by the year. and crucially, no longer includes some sense of social solidarity around the idea of having a fair shake economically, because this is a complicated country. It's always characterized as being individualistic. And of course, it is more individualistic than most continental countries, but it's also the country of the NHS and the BBC. And I think that that social solidarity element of Britishness is being sorely tested, and almost a breaking point, possibly breaking point already.
Just to dig a little bit into this first past the post question, isn't part of the rationale there that if we had a sort of mushier, more consensual form of politics, we'd have to learn to talk to each other, to give in to each other's demands? And at the moment, it all just seems a bit impositional. I mean, it seems impositional if you're a Labour voter, but it seems presumably particularly impositional if you're Scottish or Welsh, because an English government based solely on a party that you might not have voted for and your country might not vote for very much is, I mean, it's just it's partly a question about political culture, I suppose, and whether.
Yes, I mean, look, I mean, if we could settle on what we actually meant by electoral reform, I'd be up for a discussion about it. I'm slightly cautious of the argument that it necessarily creates better governments. Creates governments that are more pluralistic in the sense that they contain more parties.
Yeah.
But we've seen from the Conservative Lib Dem coalition that is another word for behind the scenes deals. Now, that may be preferable. That it may be preferable, for example, to have a Labour, SNP, Lib Dem grand coalition. I'm not arguing to the contrary. I just think it's important not to take it as axiomatic that electoral reform leads to a better, more pluralistic, more tolerant country. And indeed, I do worry that it might lead to the inclusion of some rather nasty populist elements in government.
Right, I'm going to ask Arthur Snell in a sec to make the point he makes in the chat, which is a very provocative one. But Gavin, just on this question of institutions, are we beyond the stage where institutional tinkering can deal with the sort of centrifugal forces in the country?
Possibly, although I mean, there's a number of things that I'd quite like to pick up about that. Just to begin with one point which I do refer to in the book, the question of being a member of the Permanent Five of the UN Security Council is something I discussed with diplomats at the UN. And one British diplomat said to me, if they were going to take away our veto, we'd veto it. But we wouldn't be we anymore if the United Kingdom breaks up. And I think the chance of England plus Wales, or England alone, being a permanent five member of the UN Security Council is somewhat slim.
How do they kick us off, though?
How's what?
How do they kick us off? Because you need unanimity.
Because the country wouldn't exist. When the Soviet Union collapsed, Russia had to say, please, can we, because we've got a lot of nuclear weapons, can we be a member of the Permanent Five? And of course, everybody said, yes, that's fine. But it would have to go through, I think, both not just the Security Council, but also the General Assembly. The European Union might have views on that. Nigeria might have views on it. Brazil would have views on it. India would have views on it. It is absolutely not a done deal and may be irrelevant. But if Scotland were to go, the United Kingdom would lose 32% of its landmass, probably permanent five membership of the UN Security Council, and would have to face getting the so-called independent nuclear deterrent to berth perhaps halfway up the Thames at Westminster, because it wouldn't be in Faslane. I mean, undoubtedly, Scotland would drive a very hard deal about that. But so it would be quite a profound change, which Scots, people in Northern Ireland and people in Wales have been thinking about, but broadly England hasn't. And I do talk about in the book the prospect of a federal system. But what seems to me is the kind of elephant in the room here is that when Boris Johnson was sick with coronavirus, Dominic Raab appeared and he was sort of doing the prime minister thing. Why? Why was it Dominic Raab? What was the rationale? Is it because we didn't want to have Rishi Sunak? Why wasn't it, the Home Secretary? Why was it him? And then when he was in that position, what were his powers? I listened to endless constitutional experts saying, well, he could do this and he could do that. Could Dominic Raab launch a nuclear strike? What could he do? Because we don't have a kind of user's manual for the United Kingdom as it exists. We don't have a kind of written constitution. We don't have a basic law like Germany. And so what we have endlessly over the past 50 years is things like the West Lothian question. Well, you know, federal states, to go back to Louise's point, federal states do not have a West Idaho question or a Brandenburg question, because they have a kind of way. I'm not suggesting that a written constitution is a panacea, but I do say in the book that it would be actually a way of thinking about who is in charge of what, who is responsible for what, and what you do if your prime minister gets really sick. So electoral, but the problem, I concede absolutely, is both electoral reform and the first past the post system dating back to the time of the horse and cart, the glories of an unwritten constitution, which Lord Macaulay said was like pure gold compared to paper money. Well, we don't pay with things in pure gold. We've kind of moved on. But trying to get any kind of sense of a reforming of this is going to be extremely, extremely difficult. And I have to say, when I talk to people in the SNP, they say the F word, federalism, if it includes Scotland, that bus has long since left the depot. We're not going to have it. Now, for me, that seems to me to be the last chance for bringing the United Kingdom as it's currently constituted together. And if not, then England and those, you know, England has really centralized since 1979 in many, many ways. And it's very, very different from the way in which Scotland is run or Wales is run. And it seems to me the democratic deficit within England is kind of obvious. If you ask the 3.8 million people who voted UKIP in 2015 and got Douglas Carswell as their one MP who quit, that seems to me to be a democratic deficit. It amazes me that people in England are not more upset about the fact that the first past the post system doesn't represent their views in Parliament. 4 million people almost without a single MP. I think that's a very odd system.
I'm not sure it's true that they're not bothered, because I think one of the most striking facts about the referendum was, I think, you know, almost 3 million people who hadn't voted in the election in 2015 registered and voted for the referendum, which to me was partly a kind of, my vote doesn't count there, but it counts here. So I think there is that sense. Kerry, I'm going to be really unfair. Sorry, go on.
I was just going to say, but blaming the EU for a British democratic deficit, EU's for all sorts of things, but this was a domestic problem about people not being represented, and I think that remains the problem. You know, we left the EU to solve the fact that Westminster doesn't seem to work for many people anymore.
Kerry, apologies, but do you happen to have at your fingertips any information about how the English feel about Scottish independence? Before I come on to you, Arthur, which I'm going to in a sec.
I have to confess, no, I don't have anything hard and fast in the way of facts, but could I just say two very brief things? Absolutely. Just in response. So just totally side skipping that because I don't have the data. Beautifully done. The first thing is, one of the things, just to pick up on some of the things that Gavin was just ending with saying there, is that, you know, the Tories have got a manifesto commitment to hold a commission on the constitution of opposite rights, which is remarkably undercooked as far as I can tell at the moment. So that seems to me to hold both some promise and interest, and at this very moment in time, it could, you know, is not necessarily the answer to all of these questions, but I'd be very interested to see how that moves in this space given these considerations. So that's point one. The second thing is just to pick up on something that Matt said earlier about the size of Britishness, or the, you know, the scale of Britishness, and the fact that actually it's potentially what's the word, decreasing. And one of the things, just in terms of kind of public attitudes research, I think one of the things that we know about people who voted Leave particularly is the attachment about the generation of British identity as it is to sovereignty, and this idea that sovereignty gives you scale. And this idea that sovereignty gives you the opportunity to kind of act in your own interests and therefore be competitive, or be able to kind of reach out on a kind of global stage. So just to pick up the dissonance really between the kind of maybe some of the reality around what that means, but also this kind of perception in some of the public mind around this idea that those two things are correlated when in fact they might not be.
Arthur, are you there? Do you want to annoy all the Scots?
Hi, can you hear me?
Can.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I hope I don't mean to annoy the Scots. My question is, would it matter to us in England very much if the Scots left. So on one level, maybe England and Wales. I'm going to park Northern Ireland for the moment because I think it's a separate debate.
Mhm.
England and Wales presumably would be slightly wealthier as a result, GDP per capita. We would then no longer have this destabilizing question at the heart of our debate. But I think there's also a point about the fact that we do seem to be on different trajectories. I'm not personally at all enamored of the trajectory that England is on, but it seems to be a very different trajectory from Scotland, both politically, sort of culturally, in many ways. And then, of course, you've got there's plenty of people who would probably have a negative approach to Scotland and basically say we want to get rid of them. I don't regard myself as in that category, but it seems either way. I'm not sure why it should matter so much. The problems are problems of detail, of course. The border, the currency, the monarchy, all those sorts of things. But in principle, why do English people feel strongly about this, or why should they?
Who wants to go first on this one? Would it matter to England? Should it matter to England? Matt.
It matters. It matters on this basis, which is there is an idea of Britain, and we're very bad at articulating it. The interesting contrast is with America, where there is an idea of America which is full of tensions and rifts, principally the scar of slavery. But there is an idea of America, and it's been sorely tested by the Trump presidency and other things, but it's clear. The idea of Britishness has always been, in Britain, has always been a combination of quiet institutionality and a sort of subtle pluralism, the fact that it was, more kingdoms than one. I think one of the reasons I'm sort of drawn to identity politics as a subject at the moment is that I think that a way of flipping the arguments around empire and colonialism and the decolonization of the curriculum and so on is that we are at last having an argument about what Britishness is. Now, the end product of that may be that we agree to divorce and, Scotland goes one way and England goes another. But what we have to take into account is that the consequences of that are huge, because we then become a very, very small nation state on the world stage. Now, we're already, you could argue, having left the European Union, we've already given up a lot of our negotiating power, and I do believe that. But if we let Britain become England, we are sending a signal to the world that we're contracting even further. I like the idea of Britain principally. I mean, as my name suggests, my father came here from Malta. I like Britain. I think it's a more porous idea than England. It is a pluralistic concept. It's in a lot of trouble at the moment. I'd be very sorry to see it go. And I think that the union, for all its flaws, for all its tensions, does still express something like that. But of course, to the point, if the Scots, as I said earlier, if the Scots signal that they want another referendum and they vote to leave, then clearly that they should do, and they have every right to do so. You can't hold a nation captive as part of a union, however romantic you feel about it. That would be obscene.
I'll come to you in a sec, Gavin. Jen Allerton, I notice you've got your hand up, and no one's told me what to do when people stick their hands up, but I feel a bit rude ignoring you. So if you want to come in on this point, that would be great. I'm sorry not to have given notice, but I just saw the hand sticking up just now, and I realised I might have been ignoring it.
Yeah, that's okay.
Oh, you've frozen as well.
Going back to the point, whether it was in the chat or whether it was something that was.
You're fine now.
I have a poor internet connection. I apologise.
Do you want to stick it in the chat then? Do you want to stick it in the chat and I'll look out for it?
Yeah, it's just a couple of points up, basically to do with the representation point that was a few minutes conversation now.
Okay, I'll come to that in a second. I'm just going to let Gavin address the question we had before from Arthur about should England care?
Myself, there we go. You know, I live in England. I think I could be pretty relaxed about it, bearing in mind, however, 2 or 3 things. The land border question with Scotland, which it will inevitably join the EU if it were to be independent, that would be a problem, potentially. Secondly, I would think the idea that England will be richer, I know where that comes from, and we can argue about the Barnett formula and so on, but I would just point out that when the Irish Republic and Britain both joined the EU in 1973, Ireland's GDP per capita was roughly 2/3 that of England. It's now almost twice that of England. So the idea that sort of small nations within the EU with a certain advantages wouldn't actually do better than England or England and Wales, I think is a misconception. It may not actually happen. And the third thing, and I think this is difficult to quantify, but it seems to me, as somebody who lives in and loves England, it seems to me that 400 years or more of English history has been predicated on one basic idea, which is not to let Europe somehow be in a union which holds England in real trouble. The idea that Europe would unite against England. That was true of this, you know, that was one of the reasons for the Union of the Crowns, the Protestant nations joining together against Catholic Europe. It was certainly one of the reasons why there was so many conflicts with France right up to 1815. It was certainly the reason for the conflict with Germany, the question of which was put repeatedly, you know, can we keep ourselves separate because of the Royal Navy from what's going on in Europe? Well, twice in the last century, we engaged on that continent. And then also when the Soviet Union threatened to dominate Europe. So what you could conceivably have would be a small country, England, prosperous, full of very, very smart people who would make a living and do very well, but who would find themselves isolated as other countries united in some kind of union around them. And I think that would cause some problems, not just practical problems, but also problems about England's sense of itself over the past 400 years. Would it be seen to be little England, of course, rather than Great Britain? And that to me is actually quite an important question.
I should point out, Tom Schuller says in the chat that we're already a small state. It's just we haven't quite realised it yet. But Jen, I'm not going to come to you about the PR question because I don't want to spend the last few minutes in a detailed discussion about PR, though they are really interesting points. And I should also say, Karen Key, that's up to Tortoise to do another thinking on, I think, where polarization comes from. It's a really, really interesting question, but I think if I ask that now, we would be here till well after I'd be expecting to eat my dinner, so I'm not going to. But if Jack Jenner is about, I want to raise this last question quickly. If you're around, Jack, and can, sorry, I realise I forgot to give notice about that, but...
Hello.
Hiya. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just sort of making points around the way in which Scottish independence would have a really serious impact on the Welsh independence debate. I think this is really important to me because I'm sort of somebody who's part Welsh, part English, and therefore this would sort of destruct my identity. And I think if Scotland left, the Welsh independence case would sort of transform dramatically very quickly. And we've seen that can happen because it has happened in the Scottish case. And there'd be potential for, I think, Welsh independence to follow relatively quickly because that would just completely change the shape of the debate.
Okay, brilliant. I'm just going to come to one of you on this. In fact, I'm going to come to Matt because he looks reluctant.
Well, it's true. I mean, the disaggregation is like a virus. Once you start disaggregating things, everyone wants to follow suit. So it is what's extraordinary, and I do find this extraordinary about Boris Johnson. Actually, is I think he is surprised by the extent of feeling about Scottish independence and I doubt he's given much thought to the prospect of Welsh independence at all. But of course, Scotland left, Wales would be thinking, its own thoughts. I think the practicalities of Welsh independence are, need to be thought through. But the general trend towards disaggregation is already established. The question is, can it be halted? At the moment, not conspicuously so. And I think that one of the problems with populist governments of the sort that we have is that they are really bad at getting things done. I mean, the vaccine rollout is a miracle, and thank goodness for it. But one of the things that makes it so special is it's really the only thing this government has done. And so the kind of things that need to be done to hold Britain together are not what a populist government does. A populist government identifies threats, blames people, divides in order to continue its grip upon power. The kind of things that need to be done to solidify the British idea are not the kind of things that we're going to see this government do, assuming it remains in power for the foreseeable future.
I've played this very, very badly because there was another issue I wanted to touch on, and I realise we've run out of time, for which my humble apologies. But actually, it is instructive, isn't it, that we haven't really raised the issue of sort of economics in this discussion at all. We've talked about separation, we've talked about polarisation. I just wonder, I mean, particularly in regard to Matt's point that politics is changed and it's not going back, whether, if in the autumn we find ourselves with 2.5 million unemployed, whether the debate will start to sound wearily familiar all over again, and we'll go back to that time when economics dominated, and whether in that context actually the Scots might start to pay more attention to the economic issues than was in evidence in this debate. But that's yet another thinking for the team to organise, I'm afraid, because we are out of time now. So without further ado, I apologise for being so rubbish with the chat, first and foremost, but let me thank our wonderful speakers, Kerry, Matt and Gavin, who did so well despite me. Thank you all for joining in. I'm in awe of this audience. They're still writing, my God. And look forward to the next think tank and seeing you all again. Thanks ever so much. Thank you all.